Joining us now, former chief economist of the U.S. Department of Labor, Betsy Stevenson, Financial Times columnist and head of King's College, Cambridge, Gillian Tett, and Phil Bump, who is still with us. Betsy, when E.J. Antoni says our own person, or repeats Steve Bannon wanting our own person in charge of BLS, in charge of the jobs numbers, in charge of this economic data, what does that suggest to you?
A bad idea. It suggests a very bad idea. Look, we're not supposed to have our own person. We're supposed to have somebody committed to data accuracy. And, while you're hearing some talk about commitment to data accuracy, the very idea that you would cancel the data because it's so problematic, I want to put it in context for people. Right now, there are nearly 160 million people that we're counting up as employed, and people are getting upset because we're getting it wrong by 100 or 200,000. Most of you would do the rounding I just did and go to 160 million, not 159,539,000, and get upset because maybe there were 61,000 extra or 61,000 fewer. You would just round up to 160. So the idea we'd get rid of the data in order to avoid that kind of quote, inaccuracy, unquote, shows that there's already political shenanigans getting going with this nominee.
How much can E.J. Antoni or one of Donald Trump's own people really mess with the data?
Well, here's the thing. First of all, we should say this is a big coup for Steve Bannon, who had E.J. Antoni on his War Room radio show and television show just before this announcement. And it indicates the influence of the nationalist populists and the MAGA group still have over the Trump administration. Secondly, there's been a lot of criticism of the BLS data for a long time, but they've always prided themselves inside the BLS on being non-partisan. And we should remember, it's not just the labour data they look after, they also look after the consumer price index as well, which is unbelievably sensitive and politically important right now. So to move into an era where those two crucial series are seen as being politicized is a really, really bad idea. The good news is that E.J. Antoni has said that he wants to he recognizes that the BLS staff are good. He doesn't blame them, he says, for having produced funky results recently, and he says he wants to reform them. The bad news is he's already indicated he may want to cancel the monthly data.
So what would it mean if he does cancel the monthly data?
Well, it depends on how long it's canceled for, right? He said that he wants to do it briefly while they figure out what the problems are. Of course,
what the problems are. I mean,
this
what
is
are the
point.
problems?
Exactly right. The reason the BLS does revisions of its data is to be more accurate, not less accurate, right? It is its own self-policing to make sure that they're presenting accurate data to the world because lots of people depend on it. Businesses depend on it. The government depends on it. The problem is politicians also depend on it. Politicians look at those job numbers, use it as an evaluation of their administration or of their party's leadership, and that's where we get into trouble. But you're exactly right that while he says he may want to pause it for a while and then fix things, the entire point of the BLS data is that they self-fix, and they self-fix.
That's why sometimes you see a month or two later that they'll come back and they'll revise the numbers.
Yeah, and one of the most disappointing aspects of what's happened is that business leaders and big investors rely on this data. They have a very strong vested interest in having the most accurate, credible, and bipartisan data possible. A number of statisticians have gone to those business leaders and said, would you please come out and speak out in public about the need to protect this? There has been a deafening silence. And that, to me, indicates that there's a desperate need for civic society to actually start saying, we need this stuff.
Well, I think
business needs to basically get tougher and start speaking out.
Part of it, Betsy, is I don't think a lot of people understand why this data is so necessary and what happens if this data is no longer reliable. Can you help us understand that?
This data is what tells us things like, do we need, to help support the economy because it's weakening? Are there areas where we're just not creating enough jobs? And if so, what should we do about that? Again, the CPI was mentioned. Also, is there areas where we're seeing inflation that we need to be worried about? How, for businesses, they just want to know things like, where should I find workers. Where should I locate my next store? They use this data on a daily basis to make production decisions. So if you want to think about opening a new factory, you want to understand, well, are consumers going to be out there with jobs ready to buy your stuff? And that's why we want this kind of accurate data. And I'm going to tell you the thing I'm most worried about, I don't think they're going to get out there and start faking numbers. But the reason canceling even for a few months these numbers worries me is because I think they're going to redefine them in a way that paints a rosy picture. So we have a dear leader, your economy looks great. And that's because we redefined the definitions in a way that people might say, oh, that new definition makes sense, but it hides weakening that we're already starting to see. And we won't know how to make monetary policy or fiscal policy in response to that kind of weakening.
I mean, there are practical things that people who are concerned can do right now other than simply speak out in public about the need to preserve this. There are a number of ways to create alternative private sector data sets, and there is funding going into that and activity right now to basically act as a check and balance on these numbers going forward. You can start trying to support some of the statisticians who've been trying to protect the data series because many of those vanished from websites when the Trump administration came in. And that's critical because, as she just said, you need to have a long-run series to understand what's going on. And so breaks in the series really undermine the usefulness of this.
There's also, a lot of the economists have been predicting that in these later parts of the summer and the fall, that's when inflation's really going to hit. That's when the price raises are going to be passed down to the consumer. Businesses won't be able to keep up with the tariffs for much longer on their own. And if you're starting to skip jobs reports or other, inflation data, say, over the coming few months, you might skip the more punishing moments that Donald Trump's tariffs are imposing on the economy.
Or you may be able to muddy it by blurring it all together. So
yeah.
that, so a temporary weakness isn't shown. I think one of the things people should understand, too, is the BLS data is incredibly comprehensive. We talk about jobs, we talk about CPI. But if you go to their website, the best is go to Fred, just search for Fred data and just do searches for what BLS produces. It's an astonishing amount of information. All of that is now in the hands of someone who is loyal to Donald Trump's political agenda.
So he can cherry pick?
If he so desires. My concern is what happens if we do this sort of blending, we skip a few months, and then we have these numbers that come out before the midterm elections that then get revised after the midterm elections, right? Like, that is the sort of thing that I'm concerned about and is not impossible to consider happening.
And the other thing is there are 13 different statistical agencies in America, big ones, and dozens of smaller ones. The one I'm really concerned that they're going to attack next is the Census Bureau,
right,
which
absolutely.
has been doing extraordinary work, and that is critical for business as well.